Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're going to be diving deep into a book that I'm sure most of you have at least heard of. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species,
Oh, a classic.
published all the way back in 1859. This book completely changed how we think about life on Earth.
It really did. And, even today, Darwin's ideas are still being debated and discussed. I mean, that shows you just how impactful this work is.
So, for our listeners out there who maybe haven't cracked open On the Origin of Species recently, could you give us a quick overview of what it's all about?
Well, Darwin's main point is that species aren't, these fixed, unchanging things. They evolve over time through a process he called natural selection. And, in the simplest terms, individuals with traits that help them survive in their environment, well, they're more likely to reproduce and pass those traits on. And over generations, this leads to changes in a species and even the formation of new ones.
Okay, so that's like the basic idea. But I mean, Darwin goes into a lot more detail in the book, right? And we're going to explore the book basically from beginning to end today, like following his train of thought.
Exactly. And you'll see how he carefully builds his argument. Starting with observations that pretty much anyone can understand, and then moving to these more complex ideas.
Well, that sounds fascinating. So where does he begin?
Well, he starts with something that's very familiar: domesticated animals and plants. He uses pigeons as an example, talking about how breeders select for specific traits, like fancy tail feathers or unusual colors.
So he's showing how humans can intentionally change a species over time.
Yes, and he calls this artificial selection. But then he makes this crucial leap. He argues that nature does something very similar, but on a much grander scale over vast stretches of time.
And that's where natural selection comes in.
Precisely. Darwin shows that in the wild, there's a constant struggle for existence. Organisms are competing for resources, and those with even slight advantages are more likely to survive and reproduce.
And he gives some pretty vivid examples of this struggle, right?
He does. One that stands out is his seedling experiment. He planted a bunch of seedlings in a plot of land and very carefully tracked how many survived. Turns out most of them were eaten by insects or slugs, or just simply outcompeted by other plants.
Wow, talk about a tough crowd.
Right.
So it's not just about being strong or fast, but about having traits that make you better suited to your specific environment.
Exactly. And those tiny advantages over countless generations can lead to major changes. This is where Darwin introduces the idea of divergence of character.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm familiar with that term. What does divergence of character mean?
Well, think of a tree with branches. Darwin argued that as populations face different challenges in their environments, they start to develop distinct characteristics. It's like those branches growing in different directions, and eventually they become so different they can't interbreed anymore. They become separate species.
So it's like those slight variations we talked about earlier, but magnified over huge periods of time?
Exactly. And this leads to the incredible diversity of life we see on Earth. Now, Darwin knew that this theory would raise questions, so he dedicated a whole chapter to addressing potential difficulties and objections.
Like what? What were some of the pushback he was anticipating?
Well, one big one was the lack of transitional fossils. If species evolved gradually, critics argued, shouldn't we see fossils that show those intermediate stages?
The missing link argument.
Precisely. Darwin countered this by explaining how incredibly incomplete the fossil record is. He compared it to trying to reconstruct the history of a country, using only a few random pages from its history books.
I like that analogy. So he's saying that we're only getting glimpses of the past, not the whole picture.
Exactly. And even with those glimpses, he was able to point to examples that supported his theory. Another challenge was the origin of complex organs like the eye. How could something so intricate evolve through small, gradual steps?
That's a really good question. How did Darwin respond to that?
He argued that even complex organs could have arisen through a series of tiny improvements, each one offering a slight survival advantage. He pointed to the diversity of eyes in nature, from simple, light-sensitive patches to the complex eyes of vertebrates like us, as evidence of this gradual process.
So he's saying there's not just one perfect eye, but like a whole spectrum of eye designs, each adapted to its environment.
That's right. And each small improvement along the way would have made the organism better suited to its environment, making it more likely to survive and reproduce.
This is all starting to make a lot of sense. but I have to admit, it's a lot to take in.
It is. And we're really just scratching the surface of Darwin's argument here. But before we go any further, I want to share one of his most powerful passages, where he writes about the grandeur in this view of life.
Oh yeah, I've heard that quote. What's the context?
He's talking about how all life on Earth, with its amazing diversity and complexity, ultimately arose from a few simple forms, or maybe even just one.
That's a pretty mind-blowing concept.
It is. And Darwin saw beauty in this process, in the way natural selection, operating over immense periods of time, shapes and sculpts life into the forms we see today.
And I think that's what makes On the Origin of Species so compelling. It's not just a scientific treatise. It's like this grand narrative about the history of life on Earth.
Exactly. And there's still so much more to explore. Next, we'll delve into Darwin's thoughts on instincts. Those complex behaviors that seem to be hardwired into animals.
Like a spider spinning a web, or a bird building a nest.
Exactly. Darwin had some fascinating insights into how these seemingly pre-programmed behaviors could have evolved through natural selection.
This is already so interesting. I can't wait to hear more about how Darwin tackles those more complex questions.
Darwin really was ahead of his time when it came to understanding instincts.
Okay, so remind me, what exactly is an instinct?
Well, it's like a behavior that's built in, not learned. Like, think about a baby bird. They instinctively know how to open their mouths for food, even though they've never been taught how.
Right.
Darwin argued that these seemingly pre-programmed actions could also be shaped by natural selection.
Oh, interesting. So over time, behaviors that help a species survive could become ingrained as instincts.
Exactly. And he really dives deep into this with this fascinating example of hive bees and their honeycombs.
Yeah, those honeycombs are incredible. Didn't he spend years studying bees?
He did. Darwin was very meticulous in his observations. He saw that bees create these perfectly hexagonal cells for storing honey, and he wondered how could such a complex behavior evolve.
Yeah, it does seem almost too perfect to be random.
Right. So Darwin, kind of broke down this honeycomb building into smaller steps. He argued that each step, even a slight change in the cell shape, could have offered an advantage, like saving wax or storing more honey. And those tiny advantages would then be passed down, eventually leading to the instinct we see today.
It's amazing how he connected those tiny details to the bigger picture of survival and evolution.
He was a master at that. But Darwin didn't shy away from the tougher questions either. He knew people would bring up hybrids as a challenge to his theory.
Oh yeah, because if species are constantly evolving, then why can't some of them interbreed?
Exactly. The classic example is the mule. A cross between a horse and a donkey. Mules are strong and useful, but they're sterile. And critics argued this was like a clear dividing line between species, that something prevented them from mixing freely.
So how did Darwin address this?
Well, he pointed out that hybrid sterility isn't always a black and white issue. There are degrees of sterility. And even within a species, fertility can vary.
So he's saying the lines between species aren't as rigid as we might think.
Right. He saw hybrid sterility as a consequence of species diverging, their reproductive systems becoming incompatible over time. It wasn't a deliberate barrier, but kind of a side effect of evolution.
Wow, that's a pretty nuanced view for his time.
It is. And this brings us to another big chunk of his book, geographical distribution. You see, Darwin was fascinated by where different species are found around the world.
Like his famous finches on the Galapagos Islands, right? Different beaks adapted to different food sources on each island.
Exactly. Those finches were a key piece of the puzzle for him. Darwin realized that isolation, like on those islands, could accelerate the formation of new species. He saw that closely related species might struggle to invade each other's territory, but distinct species could easily fill empty niches.
So geography plays a huge role in how evolution unfolds.
Absolutely. He went beyond just islands, too, talking about how continents move, how mountains and oceans create barriers, and how ancient climates affected where species lived. It all tied back to his main idea that the environment shapes life over time.
It's like he was piecing together this giant puzzle, using evidence from fossils and living animals and the planet itself.
And that's one of the things that makes On the Origin of Species so brilliant. Darwin synthesized information from all these different fields to tell this coherent story about how life evolved on Earth.
Yeah, it's clear that this book was the result of years of careful observation and deep thinking. And we've covered so much already, but I'm sure there's even more to uncover.
There is. One of the things that often gets overlooked is how Darwin tackles the very idea of design in nature. In his time, many people believed that the complexity of living things proved the existence of a divine creator.
So how did Darwin approach that argument? Like, did he believe in God?
Well, that's a very complex question. And remember, we're focusing on the scientific argument laid out in the text.
Mhm.
What we can discuss is how he addressed the idea of design. One of the most fascinating parts of the book is where he tackles the evolution of incredibly complex features like the eye. Critics argued that something so intricate couldn't have arisen through random variation and natural selection alone.
It's true, the eye does seem almost miraculously designed. What did Darwin have to say about that?
He actually spends quite a bit of time addressing this. Remember how we talked about his observation of diverse eye types in nature? He uses that to illustrate his point. He argues that the eye didn't just appear out of nowhere in its final perfect form. Instead, it evolved through a series of steps, each building on the previous one, each offering a survival advantage.
So he's saying that even something as complex as the eye could have evolved gradually through small incremental changes.
Exactly. And he points to the diversity of eyes in nature as evidence of this process. You have simple light-sensitive patches in some organisms, and then gradually you see more and more complex structures evolving, culminating in the sophisticated eyes of vertebrates like ourselves.
It's almost like nature is a tinkerer, constantly experimenting and refining designs over millions of years.
That's a great way to put it. Darwin argued that natural selection is the driving force behind this tinkering process. He proposed that each small improvement in eye design would have made the organism slightly better at surviving in its environment. And over countless generations, those tiny improvements could accumulate to produce the incredible complexity we see today.
This is all incredibly fascinating, but I have to admit, it's a lot to wrap my head around. It's almost like Darwin is asking us to rethink our entire understanding of how nature works.
He is, and that's what makes On the Origin of Species such a groundbreaking work. But even with all this talk of competition and survival of the fittest, Darwin doesn't paint a bleak picture of nature. He also recognized the interconnectedness of life, the way species rely on each other in complex ways.
So it's not just about individual struggle, but about the web of life evolving together.
Exactly. He even used the metaphor of a tangled bank to describe this intricate web of relationships. And this brings us to another key point Darwin makes. He didn't see nature as perfect or static. He saw it as a dynamic system, constantly changing and adapting.
I'm starting to see how his ideas challenged the traditional view of a perfectly designed, unchanging world. It's almost like he's saying nature is a work in progress, always evolving.
That's a great way to put it. And in the final parts of his book, Darwin delves even deeper into the implications of his theory, exploring how it changes our understanding of the history of life on Earth and our place within it.
I can't wait to hear about those final pieces of the puzzle. But I think we need a moment to process all this incredible information before we dive into the concluding chapters of On the Origin of Species. Welcome back to Books and Bytes. We're in the final stretch of our deep dive into Darwin's On the Origin of Species.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey from, humble pigeons to the intricate workings of the eye. Darwin's theory has really taken us through this vast landscape of ideas.
It really has. So as we wrap things up, I'm curious to hear more about those final implications you mentioned. How does Darwin kind of tie all these threads together in the concluding parts of his book?
Well, one of the most fascinating things he does is address the idea of a tree of life. Remember how we talked about divergence of character, those branches growing in different directions? Well, Darwin envisioned all life on Earth as interconnected, descending from common ancestors.
So it's not just individual species evolving, but like the entire web of life branching out over millions of years.
Exactly. He even uses the term descent with modification to describe this process. And he argues that this branching pattern explains the hierarchical way we classify organisms, from species to genera to families and so on.
It's like each level of classification represents a different branch point on that tree, like a moment in evolutionary history where lineages diverged.
That's a great way to visualize it.
Hmm.
And Darwin saw this tree of life as like a powerful confirmation of his theory. It explained not just the diversity of life, but also the underlying unity, the shared ancestry that connects us all.
It is a pretty awe-inspiring concept when you think about it. Like we're all part of this vast interconnected family tree going back billions of years.
It is. And Darwin recognized that his theory would have profound implications for how we understand the history of life on Earth. He argued that the fossil record, despite its imperfections, provided glimpses into this evolutionary past. He even predicted that future discoveries would fill in those gaps, revealing more and more transitional forms.
And he was right. I mean, paleontology has come a long way since Darwin's time, and we've found countless fossils that support his theory.
Exactly. But Darwin's vision extended beyond just fossils. He saw evolution as an ongoing process, shaping life in the present just as it did in the past. He even speculated about how human actions like selective breeding could influence the course of evolution.
So he was already thinking about the implications of human intervention in the natural world.
He was. And while he didn't have the tools to fully understand things like genetics or the impact of climate change, he really laid the groundwork for these fields of study.
It's amazing how much he was able to anticipate, given the limited knowledge available at the time.
It really is. And as we reach the end of On the Origin of Species, Darwin kind of leaves us with this sense of both wonder and responsibility. He celebrates the grandeur of life's evolution, but he also acknowledges the challenges we face as a species that has come to understand this process.
So it's not just about understanding how evolution works,
Mm.
but about what we do with that knowledge.
Yeah, precisely. Darwin's theory doesn't offer like these easy answers, but it does give us a framework for thinking about our relationship with the natural world. It reminds us that we are part of this web of life, interconnected with all other species, and that our actions have consequences for the future of evolution.
It's a powerful message, and one that's as relevant today as it was when Darwin first published his book.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up our deep dive, I think it's worth revisiting that famous passage where Darwin describes the grandeur in this view of life. It's a reminder that even amidst the struggle for existence, there's this profound beauty in the way natural selection has shaped the diversity and complexity we see around us.
Yeah, it's a vision that inspires both humility and a sense of awe. We're part of something much bigger than ourselves, a story that's been unfolding for billions of years, and one that will continue to unfold long after we're gone.
And understanding that story, thanks to Darwin's groundbreaking work, allows us to appreciate our place in the grand scheme of things. It's a legacy that continues to shape scientific thought, and one that challenges us to think deeply about our relationship with the natural world.
It's been an incredible journey exploring Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Thanks for guiding us through this fascinating book.
It's been my pleasure. And to all our listeners out there, I encourage you to pick up a copy of On the Origin of Species and experience the power of Darwin's ideas firsthand. You might be surprised at how relevant and thought-provoking his work remains, even after all these years.
That's great advice. And thanks to everyone for joining us on Books and Bytes.